A biting winter wind seeped through the cracks of the emergency room doors at New York Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, an attending physician in emergency medicine, was in the midst of her 15th consecutive hour on shift, yet she showed no signs of exhaustion. If anything, she moved with even greater precision, meticulously reviewing patient charts as she hurried from one case to another. Ever since she was a child, Elizabeth had dreamed of becoming a doctor. The journey to achieve that dream had not been easy, but she had never once considered giving up. In high school, she had woken up every morning at 4 a.m., studying before class. After school, she spent hours in the library, pushing herself beyond her limits. She had to succeed, not just for herself, but for her mother, who had worked long shifts at a factory to provide for them. To earn a scholarship, she made sure she never once lost her spot as valedictorian, and in the end, she secured admission to Harvard Medical School. Even as a medical student, the grueling curriculum never shook her focus. As a resident, she quickly earned the respect of her senior doctors, who often remarked, "Dr. Carter is one of the most thorough and dedicated physicians in this hospital." It was not an exaggeration. She treated every patient in the ER as if they were her own family, and she had a particular soft spot for single parents and those from disadvantaged backgrounds. The clock struck 2 a.m., the rhythmic ticking echoing through the bustling ER. At that moment, the automatic doors burst open. Paramedics rushed in, pushing a stretcher carrying an elderly homeless man. The stench of alcohol and sweat clung to him, his coat tattered, his body motionless. "It's him again," a nurse muttered under her breath. "Where did they find him this time?" "Collapsed on the street," one of the paramedics replied. "His body temperature is dangerously low. He's at risk for hypothermia." Just then, Elizabeth froze mid-step. It felt as if her blood had turned to ice, and her heart pounded against her ribs. With trembling hands, she reached for the patient's chart. Name: Thomas Carter. 67 years old. 26 years ago, when Elizabeth was only 9, this man had abandoned her. Her father. Her mind went blank. A high-pitched ringing filled her ears. Flashes of childhood memories rushed back like a tidal wave. The terror, the sorrow, the nights she spent waiting by the window, hoping he would come home. "Dr. Carter, are you okay?" A nurse's voice snapped her back to reality. "Why, yes, I'm fine," she managed, though her voice betrayed her trembling composure. The ER was still in full motion. The beeping of monitors, the hurried footsteps of nurses, the muffled groans of patients in pain. Yet, to Elizabeth, all of it faded into silence. All she could see was him, a man who had once been her father. For the first time in her life, she hesitated. Her duty as a doctor and her past as an abandoned daughter clashed violently within her. The clock kept ticking, but she remained frozen, unable to make a decision. Elizabeth's gaze remained fixed on Thomas Carter's frail, unkempt form. There had been a time when he had been strong and confident, but now he reeked of alcohol, his thin frame swallowed by an oversized, ragged coat. His nails were grimy, his hair matted, and deep scars lined his weathered face, telling the story of a hard-lived life. His vitals are unstable, his blood pressure is dropping fast. A nurse called out urgently. Elizabeth took one deep breath before finally stepping forward. She placed her stethoscope over his chest. The sound of his heartbeat was irregular, weak, barely holding on. Years of alcoholism had left his heart damaged, struggling to function. "Move him to the ICU," Elizabeth ordered, her voice cold and firm. "Keep monitoring his oxygen levels and cardiac rhythm. Administer 4 fluids at 200 cubic centimeters per hour." At that moment, she wasn't his daughter. She was his doctor. And a doctor saves lives, no matter who the patient is. Hours later, Thomas Carter slowly regained consciousness in the ICU. His hazy eyes fluttered open, scanning the unfamiliar room. And then, his gaze landed on her. "Hey, Doc, does this mean I survived?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Yes," Elizabeth replied flatly, masking her emotions. A faint, weary chuckle escaped his lips. "Damn, would have been nice to have a doctor like you in my family." Elizabeth felt something tighten in her chest. The irony. His own daughter had saved his life, and yet he had no idea. His voice softened, more to himself than to her. "I wonder where my kid is now, probably still hates me." His eyes drifted shut again, exhausted. Elizabeth stood there, frozen. 1,000 thoughts churned in her mind, but none of them made it past her lips. In the end, she turned on her heel and walked out. She reached the door, paused for a brief moment, but never turned back. Just like he hadn't, all those years ago. Days passed, and Thomas Carter's condition steadily improved. His vitals stabilized, and his lucidity returned. Yet, Elizabeth's heart grew heavier with each passing day. "Dr. Carter, the patient in room 312 is well enough for discharge. We can start preparing his release paperwork," the head nurse informed her, holding a clipboard. "Understood," Elizabeth muttered, rubbing her temples. She had been avoiding his room, pacing outside his door, but never entering. The irony wasn't lost on her. A doctor who could face life and death every day, but couldn't face her own past. Back in her office, she opened a worn leather wallet. Inside was an old photograph, a relic from a time when she still had a family. In it, a 9-year-old Elizabeth beamed between her parents. Her mother's gentle eyes radiated warmth, while Thomas Carter, a much younger man, had an easygoing smile. "Mom," Elizabeth whispered, her thumb grazing the image. Her mother used to say, "Resentment is a disease, Liz. If you hold on to it too long, it will only poison your own heart." But how could she let go? For 26 years, that man had been a ghost in her life. Late that night, the hospital was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered softly, casting a sterile glow over the halls. Elizabeth found herself standing outside room 312. Through the narrow window, she saw him, her father, sleeping soundly. His lined face bore the marks of a hard life. His bony hands, resting limply at his sides, looked like they had known too much hardship. For the first time in years, she said it aloud. "Dad." The word felt foreign on her lips, like a language she had forgotten how to speak. 26 years. How many nights had she hated him? How many times had she tried to erase him from her memory, only for his absence to define her even more? Elizabeth hesitated before quietly stepping inside. She took a seat by his bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The heart monitor beeped in the background, the rhythm stronger now, because of her. She had saved his life. And he didn't even know. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered. But the only response was the rhythmic hum of the machines. Then, in his sleep, Thomas stirred. And then he mumbled something, just a whisper, almost lost in the quiet. "I'm sorry." Elizabeth stiffened. Her heart clenched, her throat tightened. For 26 years, those were the words she had ached to hear. But did he even know what he was apologizing for? Was it a drunken regret? A fleeting whisper from a man who had lost everything? Or did he remember? Elizabeth didn't know. She rose to her feet, gripping the chair to steady herself. She wanted to scream, to shake him awake and demand answers. But instead, she walked away. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. Her mind had been restless all night. As she approached the nurse's station, the head nurse handed her a yellow discharge slip. "Dr. Carter, the patient in 312 insists on leaving today," she said with a sigh. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. "Already?" He still needs monitoring. He says he can't afford to stay longer. Elizabeth clenched her jaw. That familiar helplessness returned, the feeling of watching him walk away, just like he had done when she was a child. And again, she let him go. Later that morning, she stood in the doorway as Thomas Carter buttoned up his frayed coat, his belongings stuffed into a torn duffel bag. For a fleeting second, she considered stopping him, telling him everything. Instead, her voice came out flat. "You need regular meals and rest," she said, forcing professionalism into her tone. He glanced at her, half smiling. "Yes, Doc," he said, adjusting his bag over his shoulder. Then he turned toward the door, walking slowly down the hallway. His posture was stooped, his frame frail. Just before stepping out, he paused. And then, in the smallest voice, "Doctor, do you think my son could have become someone like you?" Elizabeth stopped breathing. Her chest ached, and for a moment, she almost told him. Instead, she swallowed hard and said, "I think he became a great person." Her father nodded, his lips pressing together as if holding back tears. And then he walked out of her life. Days later, Elizabeth was deep into her shift when a nurse approached her, holding a folded piece of paper. "Dr. Carter, we just found this. It was left behind by the patient from 312. Elizabeth took it with shaking hands. The paper was old, creased from being carried around too much. Inside, the handwriting was crooked, unsteady. "To the doctor, who saved me. Thank you for treating someone like me with kindness. I never thought I deserved it. Maybe if I had met a doctor like you sooner, my life would have turned out different. I hope my son is somewhere safe, living a good life. I hope he is happy." At the bottom of the page, ink stains had blurred the last few words, as if touched by tears. Elizabeth stood there, the world spinning too fast around her. Her hands gripped the note tightly, but she couldn't steady herself. He had no idea, she thought. A part of her wanted to run after him, to scream the truth. But she had already let him go. Months passed. Seasons changed. But Elizabeth never saw Thomas Carter again. She kept looking. Whenever she passed homeless shelters, whenever the ER doors swung open, she half expected to see him again. She never did. One freezing winter morning, as she walked to work, something caught her eye. An old man, sitting alone on a bench in a small park. For a split second, her heart leaped. But as she approached, she realized it wasn't him. Still, something in her urged her to stop. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Do you happen to know a man named Thomas Carter?" The elderly man's gaze flickered. "Carter? Oh, that guy. He used to sit here every morning like he was waiting for someone," he muttered. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "Waiting for who?" "Don't know," the man shrugged. Then one day he left. Said he had somewhere to be. Said he was going to find someone. Elizabeth's hands went cold. "Find someone?" "Yeah." He said he had to find his son. The weight in her chest threatened to crush her. He had been waiting. For her. And now he was gone. She turned, stepping out of the park as snow began to fall. She clutched the letter in her pocket, feeling its edges press into her palm. Somewhere he was still out there. Maybe looking for her. Maybe starting over. She would never know. But she whispered anyway, "Dad, I hope you found what you were looking for." And as the snow drifted down, for the first time in years, she let go.